Lauren Bishop had lived on the wide stretch of land her late husband had left her, a ranch that seemed to stretch endlessly under the Texas sky for almost a decade now, and in all that time she had never once considered it anything other than sacred ground. The house, a weathered two-story structure with wraparound porches and broad windows, carried the weight of memory in every creak of the wooden floors and every draft that passed through the hallway. It was where she and Daniel had planned a future, and although that future had been cut short by the sudden accident that claimed him, she stayed because the land itself had become a part of her. The paddocks, the stables, the rusted water tower at the edge of the property, all of it was more than real estate. It was a living monument to the man she had loved and the independence they had fought to keep. People in the neighboring community might have seen only fences and open fields, but for her, every corner of the ranch was charged with stories, whether it was the oak tree under which Daniel once proposed to her, or the small corral where she had learned to calm the younger horses with his patient instruction. Lauren was not a woman who sought out company. In fact, since Daniel's death, she had preferred solitude, believing that the constant bustle of people only dulled the sharper truths of life. She kept her circles small and her routines precise. Early mornings spent feeding and grooming the horses, afternoons repairing fences or tending to the neglected orchard, evenings retreating to the porch with a book or simply staring at the horizon. As the sky shifted from molten orange to starlit black, the ranch was quiet, sometimes oppressively so, but she had made peace with that quiet, turning it into a kind of shield against the world outside. She knew every sound it made, every smell carried on the wind, every subtle change in the earth after rain. Her neighbors respected her, but they did not know her well, and Lauren liked it that way. There had always been a distance between her ranch and the neatly trimmed lawns of the subdivision managed by the homeowners association down the road. Those streets, lined with identical mailboxes and regulations about paint colors, represented everything Daniel had despised about modern living. He used to laugh that he would sooner sleep in the barn than let a board of retirees tell him what kind of fence to build, or how long his grass could grow. That disdain had rubbed off on her. The HOA was, to her, a curiosity at best and a nuisance at worst, a gathering of people who had mistaken their bylaws for real authority. Even so, she rarely thought about them. Her land had been purchased long before the subdivision was ever planned, and legally it stood apart, its boundaries firm and undisputed. She paid her taxes directly to the county, kept her permits in order, and never asked anything of the neighbors beyond being left alone. For Lauren, this independence was not just a lifestyle, but a matter of principle. She had grown up under the hand of a controlling father, then married a man who had shown her what it meant to live freely, and she would never again surrender her choices to anyone else. The very soil beneath her boots reminded her daily that she had fought to hold on to something unshakably her own. Yet the quiet that she had built for herself was not unbroken. At times, she felt the pressure of change hovering beyond her fences. She noticed the way more traffic passed along the county road, the way developers eyed parcels of land that bordered her ranch, the way glossy flyers for community events sometimes ended up in her mailbox even though she had no part in the association. She would glance at them briefly, shake her head at the pictures of food trucks and carnival rides, and toss them into the trash. They belonged to another world, one she had no intention of joining. The ranch was her refuge, and as long as she drew breath, she would keep it closed to outsiders. Her closest connection to the outside world came in occasional visits from her younger brother, who lived 2 towns away and worried that she was becoming too isolated, too stubborn. He urged her to sell a portion of the land, to downsize, to find comfort in something more manageable. Lauren always dismissed his concerns. The ranch was not a burden to her. It was the one thing that still felt solid beneath her. She had seen too many people trade away their legacies for convenience, only to regret it when nothing remained of what their families had built. She swore she would never do that. To her, letting the land slip into someone else's hands would be the same as erasing Daniel's life altogether. Each morning when she woke before dawn and walked the fence line, she felt that vow steadying her. The dew on the grass, the low snort of horses shifting in the corral, the sight of the barn's roof cutting against the first streak of light in the sky. It reminded her why she endured the long days and the aching solitude. Her ranch was not just real estate, it was memory, promise, and inheritance. And though she rarely allowed herself to imagine threats to it, she knew in her bones that if ever anyone tried to take it from her or twist it to their purposes, she would stand her ground without hesitation, because everything that mattered to her was bound up in this land, and she had already lost too much to let the rest be stolen. It began in the kind of ordinary way that made it all the more unsettling, as if the first sign of intrusion had slipped into her life without ceremony, hidden in the trivial rhythm of a day she had expected to pass like any other. Lauren Bishop had been returning from the feed store, the bed of her truck loaded with sacks of grain and bales of hay, when she noticed the first hint that something was off. Her mailbox, a battered metal thing perched on an old wooden post, usually contained little more than utility bills or the occasional letter from her brother. That afternoon, however, when she swung the rusted door open, she found a glossy trifold brochure wedged inside, its bright colors startling against the dust and faded envelopes. She pulled it out absent-mindedly, intending to toss it onto the passenger seat without a glance, but the words printed across the front stopped her cold. Annual Summer Festival, hosted at Bishop Ranch. At first, she thought it was a mistake. She stood there in the dry Texas heat, the sun pressing against her neck, staring at the page in disbelief. The photographs showed families laughing beneath carnival tents, children holding balloon animals, a stage with musicians performing under string lights. Beneath the images was an address, her address, and a schedule of events that stretched across 3 days. Beneath that, in bold letters, was a line that made her blood run cold. Tickets, available now. Parking and main entrance through South Gate. The South Gate was hers, the old iron gate that Daniel had welded by hand, the gate she locked every night. Before turning in, Lauren climbed into her truck, her hands trembling slightly as she spread the brochure across the steering wheel. It was not some vague advertisement, it was a polished announcement, complete with sponsors, ticket prices, and instructions for vendors to apply for booths. There were phone numbers and email addresses, a list of bands, even a small note promising fireworks over the open fields of the ranch on Saturday night. She could hardly breathe as she read it, the absurdity of it clashing violently with the hard truth she knew. No one had ever asked her permission, no one had spoken to her, and there was not a chance in hell that she would have agreed to something like this. When she pulled into the ranch a few minutes later, dust curling behind the truck in long golden plumes, the sight waiting for her struck her as even more unreal. Parked by the outer fence, near the south gate itself, was a box truck painted in faded carnival stripes. Several young men were unloading aluminum poles, folding chairs, and what looked like heavy canvas tarps. They moved with the brisk efficiency of workers who believed they had every right to be there, laughing and calling to each other as they stacked equipment in the grass. For a moment, Lauren sat frozen behind the wheel, staring at them, her pulse hammering in her ears. She half expected one of them to glance up sheepishly and apologize for the mix-up, to admit they had taken a wrong turn. But when she stepped out and demanded to know what they were doing, the response was delivered with the casual indifference of men who had repeated the explanation a dozen times already. "We're here for the festival, ma'am. HOA told us to set up the preliminary structures today. We've got clearance for this property." One of them even produced a folded sheet of paper, some kind of permit with official-looking stamps, as if that flimsy piece of paper could override the fact that the land they stood on was privately owned. Lauren felt the ground shift beneath her feet. It was not just a matter of an errant flyer or a clerical mistake. This was an organized plan, and the gears of it were already in motion. She ordered them off her land, her voice sharper than she had intended, and after some muttering and reluctant gathering of their equipment, they climbed back into the truck, but not before one of them smirked and said that she might want to clear things up with the board before the main crews arrived. The implication was chilling. This was not a misunderstanding to be brushed aside. This was an assertion, a claim made in the open, as if her silence could be taken as consent and her land transformed into a stage simply because someone had decided it was convenient. By the time she reached her front porch, the brochure in her hand felt like a weapon, the slick paper almost mocking in its cheerful colors. She sat heavily in one of the wooden chairs, staring across the pasture, trying to piece together how such a violation could have taken root without her knowledge. She thought of Daniel, of the conversations they used to have about control, about how fragile the concept of ownership became when those with power decided to bend rules. He had always warned her that neighbors and boards and small-town politics could chew away at property lines like termites in wood, invisible until the damage was too deep to fix. She had dismissed those warnings once as cynicism, but now she felt the truth of them seeping into her bones. That night she barely slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw her ranch overrun by strangers, tents and food trucks dotting the fields, her horses skittish from the noise of fireworks, the fences trampled by careless crowds. She woke before dawn, made coffee she could hardly drink, and sat at the kitchen table with the brochure laid out before her. She read every line, every disclaimer, until her vision blurred. It was not only that her land had been listed as the venue. Her own name appeared in the fine print, as though she had endorsed the festival. The betrayal in that detail was almost worse than the trespass itself. It suggested forgery, manipulation, and a deliberate effort to erase her voice. By sunrise, her confusion had hardened into something closer to fury. She knew where she would go first. The office of the HOA, a squat beige building that squatted like a bureaucratic parasite at the edge of the subdivision. She had ignored their notices for years, knowing they had no jurisdiction over her. But now she realized ignoring them had allowed them to weave their narrative unchecked. The workers' smug expressions replayed in her head, the casual way they had invoked the HOA as if it were a sovereign power. She would demand answers, demand to see the supposed authorization, demand to know who had dared to put her land up for sale as if it were a stage to be rented. And beneath her anger lay a cold, unfamiliar unease, the kind that whispered this was not a mistake at all but a carefully orchestrated move, and that those behind it had already prepared for her resistance. The office of the HOA did not look like the seat of authority it pretended to be, but rather like a converted insurance agency from the 70s, with a cracked asphalt parking lot and a sun-faded sign perched on metal poles that buzzed faintly in the heat. Lauren parked her truck at the far end, the glossy festival brochure clenched in her hand, and walked across the lot with the tense, deliberate stride of someone forcing herself to keep calm. Inside, the air was chilled to an artificial degree, the fluorescent lights humming above a carpet that smelled faintly of mildew, and at the reception desk a woman with pale hair pulled tight into a bun barely glanced up from her screen when Lauren gave her name. "Do you have an appointment?" the woman asked flatly, her nails clicking against the keyboard. Lauren said no. This could not wait. That her land had been claimed for an event she had never authorized, and she needed to speak to whoever had signed off on it. After a moment's sighing hesitation, the receptionist disappeared into a hallway lined with cheap wooden paneling, leaving Lauren to stand there with her jaw set, resisting the urge to pace. When the receptionist returned, she was accompanied by a man whose presence seemed deliberately cultivated to radiate calm authority. He was tall, silver-haired, dressed in a gray linen suit that hung just a little too elegantly for this backwater office, and his eyes carried the measured coolness of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He introduced himself as Marcus Ellington, the current president of the association, and extended a hand with a polite smile that never reached his eyes. Lauren did not take it. Instead, she thrust the brochure toward him and demanded an explanation. Marcus glanced at it with a faint look of amusement, as though she were presenting him with a children's drawing, then gestured smoothly toward a side office. "Why don't we discuss this privately?" he said, and without waiting led her into a small room where blinds shut out the sunlight and the only decoration was a framed print of a golf course. Lauren remained standing as Marcus settled behind the desk and folded his hands. He spoke with the careful cadence of a practiced negotiator, acknowledging that yes, the festival was planned, yes, Bishop Ranch had been selected as the location, and yes, she had signed the authorization. At that, Lauren nearly laughed in disbelief, slapping her palm against the desk and insisting she had never put her name to anything of the sort. Marcus, unruffled, opened a folder and slid across a sheet of paper bearing her signature. Lauren stared at it, her stomach twisting, because at first glance it was undeniably hers, the swoop of the L, the curve of the B. But she knew, with a certainty deeper than proof, that she had never signed this page. She told him so, her voice tightening, and Marcus only gave a soft sigh as though disappointed in a child. "Perhaps you don't remember. We sent the forms months ago. There was ample opportunity to contest them. In any case, it is filed and registered. The community is counting on this festival, and we cannot disappoint them." The phrasing, "the community," made her bristle. She reminded him sharply that her land was not part of their jurisdiction, that Bishop Ranch had existed long before the HOA, and that she had no obligation to bow to its decisions. Marcus tilted his head, the smile fading into something colder. He spoke of shared roads and regional easements, hinting that because she used the same county-maintained stretch that ran past the subdivision, her property could reasonably be considered part of the extended neighborhood. He mentioned bylaws she had never heard of, revised only last year, that granted the board latitude to designate land for communal benefit. His voice was smooth, but there was steel underneath, and for the first time, Lauren felt that she was not arguing with a misguided bureaucrat, but with a man who had prepared his case long before she walked in. She demanded to see the full set of documents, and after a pause he allowed her a brief glance. What she saw made her skin crawl. Not just her alleged authorization, but maps with her boundaries subtly redrawn, contracts already signed with vendors, and notes referring to expected capacity of 3,500 attendees. It was not a plan in progress. It was a plan completed, one that assumed her compliance as a given. Lauren snapped the folder shut and shoved it back across the desk, declaring that if a single truck rolled onto her land again, she would treat it as trespassing and call the sheriff. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, and then, as if a switch had flipped, he leaned back and offered her that same polished smile once more. "You are, of course, welcome to consult legal counsel," he said, "but I assure you, everything has been done according to the letter of the law. The festival will proceed. It would be unfortunate if you chose to make yourself an obstacle to the community." The conversation ended there, not with resolution, but with a stalemate thick enough to choke on. Lauren walked out of the building feeling as though she had stepped off a cliff into air, her mind buzzing with fragments of anger and fear. The heat outside pressed against her like a wall, and she gripped the truck door harder than necessary, needing the solidity of the metal beneath her hand. Driving back along the county road, she kept replaying the man's words, the casual certainty with which he dismissed her protest, and she realized that she was up against something far larger than a scheduling error or a pushy neighbor. This was machinery already in motion, and Marcus Ellington was the conductor, smiling as the wheels ground forward. That night, sitting on her porch with the crickets rasping in the darkness and the stars cold above, she studied the forged signature in her memory and felt a chill unlike any she had known on the ranch before. Her sanctuary was no longer safe by default. Someone had drawn her into a game she had never agreed to play, and they were playing for keeps. The first skirmish had ended not in victory but in revelation, and the revelation was this: her land was no longer seen as hers alone. It had become a prize, and those who wanted it were willing to bend paper, rules, and truth itself until she was pushed aside. The morning after her confrontation with Marcus Ellington, Lauren woke with a heaviness in her chest that felt like the weight of an oncoming storm. The forged signature haunted her. She had lain awake for hours staring at the ceiling, her mind trying and failing to comprehend how such a blatant falsehood could be presented with such confidence. How a man could hand her a document bearing her name and dare her to disprove it as though truth were nothing more than a negotiable commodity. By the time dawn crept pale and cold across the horizon, she knew that arguing with him face to face had accomplished nothing, and if anything, had confirmed that the association had prepared carefully for her resistance. They had rehearsed their lines, built their scaffolding of paperwork, and woven a narrative that painted her not as an unwilling victim, but as a cooperative host. It was not outrage alone that gnawed at her now, but the terrible realization that without proof she could be dragged into their fiction and swallowed by it. The day began as usual, with the smell of hay and the restless sounds of horses in the paddock, but even the ordinary chores felt brittle and precarious, as if they belonged to a world already slipping out from under her. When the sound of engines rose from the county road, she froze, pitchfork still in her hands, and listened to the unmistakable rumble of heavy tires. She walked to the gate, her boots kicking up dust, and saw not one but 3 trucks idling just beyond the fence. Their sides bore the logos of rental companies and catering businesses, and from the cabs emerged men in neon vests carrying clipboards and tool belts. They approached with the brisk authority of people who had been told this was their site, and one of them called over the fence that they were here to begin laying out the vendor tents. Lauren shouted back that they were trespassing, that they had no right to set foot on her property, and the man shrugged with a kind of bored pity as he waved a laminated badge clipped to his vest. "Authorized contractor," he said, and when she demanded to know authorized by whom, he replied simply, "The HOA board. Your name's on the approval." He spoke as though it were beyond question, and as if her anger were no more than a tantrum. Lauren felt her throat tighten with fury. She ordered them to turn their trucks around, and when one of them began to unlatch the back gate, she grabbed the chain on her side and locked it tighter, glaring at them through the bars of Daniel's old ironwork. They conferred briefly among themselves, their voices low, then retreated to their trucks. But before they left, one of them slipped an envelope through the bars of the gate. Inside, she found an itinerary, detailed down to the hour, with her ranch listed as festival grounds, access confirmed, and beneath the schedule was a small note that chilled her more than anything yet. Ensure cooperation. Minimize conflict. The casual, bureaucratic phrasing, as if she were nothing more than a potential inconvenience, stripped away the last of her disbelief. This was not an accident. This was conquest disguised as organization. That evening, still shaking with anger, she drove into town and sought out the county records office. The clerk at the desk was a middle-aged man with weary eyes who at first seemed disinterested in her story, but when she insisted on seeing the property files, he pulled up the electronic records and frowned. According to the system, there had indeed been a recent adjustment filed on the Bishop Ranch boundaries, extending an easement to cover community events access. The form listed her as the petitioner, with her signature neatly typed beneath. Lauren felt sick as she leaned closer, recognizing the same forgery she had seen in Ellington's office. She demanded to know how such a thing could be processed without her present, and the clerk admitted that while signatures were meant to be verified, in practice the office relied on notaries and submitted documents, rarely cross-checking against living owners unless a dispute was raised. In other words, the system had been designed for trust, and Ellington had exploited that trust with precision. For a moment, Lauren stood there in the harsh light of the county office, the sound of printers churning in the background, and felt a kind of vertigo. She could see the path ahead of her laid out like the dirt tracks across her pastures. If she did nothing, the festival would be built, the trespass normalized, and her resistance rewritten into apathy. If she fought, she would be dismissed as unreasonable, her objections drowned out by papers bearing her false consent. Neither option resembled justice. She asked the clerk if she could obtain certified copies of the forged documents, and after some hesitation he agreed, sliding across forms for her to sign and stamping the papers with the official seal. The cold weight of the embossed seal against the page gave her a small but vital foothold. She would have evidence now, not just outrage. Driving back that afternoon, she kept checking the rearview mirror, her nerves prickling as if she expected to see a car following her. The paranoia unsettled her because it did not feel like paranoia at all. It felt like instinct, sharpened by the calculated precision of those who had already stepped onto her land without permission. When she reached the ranch, she circled the perimeter slowly, checking every stretch of fence, and it was there, along the northern boundary where the barbed wire sagged between old posts, that she found the first real sign of intrusion. A section of wire had been cleanly cut, the ends coiled and tucked aside as though waiting to be opened again. In the dirt nearby were tire tracks, not from her truck, but from something lighter, perhaps an ATV. And scattered just beyond the break in the fence lay a bundle of plastic wristbands, bright blue with the words "Festival Access" printed in cheerful lettering. She gathered them in her hands and felt her stomach twist. The invasion was not a distant possibility. It was being staged in real time. That night she called her brother, her voice shaking as she described what was happening. He urged her to contact a lawyer immediately to file an injunction, but Lauren hesitated. Part of her still clung to the stubborn independence that had kept her anchored to the ranch all these years, a conviction that she could stand her ground alone. Yet, as she hung up the phone and walked out onto the porch, the night air heavy with the scent of cedar, she realized that the ground was shifting beneath her faster than she could reinforce it. The HOA was not bluffing. They had extended their reach into county records, into contracts, into the machinery of local governance, and if she did not act decisively, they would pave over her ownership with a paper trail she had no hand in writing. In that moment, beneath the stars that had once offered comfort but now seemed indifferent, Lauren felt the pivot of her struggle. It was no longer a question of whether she would fight, but how, and whether the strength she had left could hold against forces that wore the mask of law while moving like trespassers in the dark. The midpoint had arrived, not in triumph, but in revelation, and the revelation was cruelly simple. She was already at war, and the first battles were being fought not with weapons or fists but with documents, signatures, and quiet footsteps through the grass where her fences once stood whole. The days that followed her discovery at the county office blurred into a tense vigil, each hour marked by a gnawing sense that the next intrusion was already on its way, that the quiet fields surrounding her house were nothing more than a stage, waiting for actors who believed the script had been written without her. Lauren forced herself to keep her routines, feeding the horses, mending the fences, walking the orchard. Yet each motion carried an undercurrent of watchfulness, as if every rustle of grass could betray a trespasser. Her suspicions proved correct when one morning she woke to the sound of vehicles idling in the distance. She hurried to the porch, pulling on her boots, and saw through the rising heat shimmer a caravan of delivery vans stopped just beyond the southern gate. Men in uniforms unloaded metal barricades, stacks of folding tables, and bright plastic coolers. When she approached, shouting across the fence, they barely acknowledged her fury. One man, older than the rest, lifted a clipboard and read her name from the top of the delivery order. "Bishop Ranch," he said, as if that were explanation enough, then gestured to the gate as though expecting her to open it. Lauren refused, locking the chain tighter, her heart thundering as she warned them they had no right, that she would call the sheriff. For a moment she thought they might push anyway, but after a short, murmured discussion they reloaded their vans, leaving a single crate behind the fence as though to mark the ground in advance. When she opened it later, she found a bundle of laminated passes, each stamped with the festival's name and dates, as if mocking her with the inevitability of the event. She burned them in a rusted barrel behind the barn, watching the smoke twist into the evening sky, yet the gesture brought no satisfaction, only the certainty that more would come. She decided she could not stand alone forever. So she drove 2 towns over to meet with Aidan Holt, a retired soldier who had once served with her late husband and who had remained a distant but reliable figure in her life. Aidan was grayer now, his left leg stiff from an old injury, but his eyes carried the same sharpness that had once made Daniel trust him implicitly. When she told him about the forged signatures, the trucks, the cut fences, he listened without interruption, then finally nodded and said that what she faced was not mere incompetence but a campaign, one that required discipline to resist. He offered to help, not with lawyers or politics, but with vigilance, and within days he had set up motion lights along the ranch road and convinced her to reinforce the gates with heavy chains and steel stakes. His presence, quiet and steady, gave her a measure of strength, though she could see in his expression that he expected the worst was yet to come. His prediction proved right. One night, close to midnight, Lauren was jolted awake by the dogs barking furiously. She grabbed her flashlight and rushed to the porch with Aidan already moving across the yard, his rifle slung across his shoulder. At the edge of the northern pasture they found tire marks fresh in the soil and, scattered in the grass, cardboard signs stenciled with arrows and the words, "Festival Entrance." Whoever had placed them had done so quickly, slipping through the cut. Wire again, and their escape was recent enough that the smell of gasoline still lingered faintly in the air. Aidan crouched, studied the tracks, and said they were made by a small truck or van, perhaps the same type they had seen before. He gathered the signs and piled them by the fence, his jaw tight, and told her plainly that what they were facing was not simply a dishonest board, but people testing how far they could push before she broke. The next blow came not through the fences but through paper. A certified letter arrived, bearing the stamp of the HOA's legal counsel, accusing her of sabotaging a community initiative and threatening civil penalties for obstruction of authorized development. It demanded payment of damages for delays, already incurred, a sum so absurd she laughed bitterly before the weight of it crushed her. To ignore it would risk default. To fight it meant money she did not have. She read the letter aloud to Aidan, her voice cracking with frustration, and he muttered that he had seen tactics like this overseas, where pressure came not with bullets but with paperwork designed to exhaust the will before the body. Lauren's brother urged her to file an injunction, but the nearest lawyer willing to take the case required a retainer that would have gutted her savings. Instead, she gathered what evidence she had: the certified copies from the county, the photographs of cut fences, the discarded signs and wristbands. She began to keep a journal, recording each trespass in meticulous detail, as though arming herself with truth would be enough to counter their forgeries. Yet she knew evidence alone might not matter when the system itself seemed tilted in their favor. Then came the incident that stripped away any illusion of safety. One afternoon, she returned from town to find the southern gate standing wide open. Panic surged through her as she drove up the dirt path, half expecting to see her barn ransacked or her horses scattered. Instead, she found the animals restless but unharmed, and in the middle of the yard, staked into the soil, a single banner fluttering in the wind. It read, in cheerful bold letters, "Welcome to Bishop Ranch Festival Grounds." The sight of it, planted so brazenly in the heart of her sanctuary, brought her to her knees. Aidan tore it down with a curse, but the damage was already done. The message was clear. They would not wait for permission. They would take what they wanted and leave her to scream into the wind. That night, sitting on the porch with Aidan silent beside her, Lauren realized the escalation was complete. She was no longer defending against whispers of paperwork or vague threats of fines. She was standing at the threshold of invasion. Her ranch turned into a battlefield of wills, and the next move would determine whether she lost everything Daniel had left her, or proved that even a system built on forged signatures and hollow authority could be resisted. The war had arrived at her doorstep, and she could feel it pressing against the very gates she had sworn to keep closed. The morning of the festival arrived not with the quiet peace Lauren usually cherished, but with the restless vibration of engines on the horizon and the faint echo of voices carried on the wind. and she knew even before she stepped onto the porch that the confrontation she had dreaded was no longer avoidable. From the ridge, she could see the procession of buses, vans, and pickup trucks rolling slowly down the county road, their occupants brimming with expectation, vendors craning their necks as they studied their maps, drivers following signs that had been planted by unseen hands in the night to guide them to her southern gate. The ranch looked deceptively calm under the broad Texas sky, but Lauren could feel the storm breaking inside her chest. Aiden had already parked her tractor across the entrance, its massive tires pressed into the dirt like immovable anchors, and around it they had wound heavy chains that clinked against the iron bars of Daniel's welded gate. Motion lights flickered to life in the rising sun, and on the porch a stack of documents waited, the certified records and copies of forged signatures, the evidence she had pieced together like weapons. When the first vehicles pulled up and idled in front of the barrier, confusion flickered across the drivers' faces. Men stepped down from their vans, squinting at the locked gate, some waving clipboards as though a piece of paper could force steel to yield. One of them shouted that they had permits, that she was supposed to let them through, and Lauren walked forward, her boots crunching on gravel, her voice steady despite the adrenaline tearing through her veins. She told them calmly and clearly that this was private land, that no permission had ever been given, that any attempt to cross the barrier would be trespassing. A few muttered angrily. One cursed, another threatened to call the sheriff, but she held her ground, her hand resting on the cool iron of the gate as if drawing strength from its solidity. Then, as she had known he would, Marcus Ellington arrived. His black SUV pulled up smoothly behind the stalled caravan, and when he emerged in his immaculate linen suit, he carried himself not as a man facing resistance, but as a master of ceremonies interrupted mid-performance. He strode forward, his voice pitched to carry over the crowd, addressing not Lauren but the vendors and drivers. He assured them that this was merely a misunderstanding, that Mrs. Bishop had agreed months ago that her consent was on record, and that she was simply having second thoughts. He turned to her then, the smile sharp as glass, and urged her to unlock the gate, reminding her that the community had already invested, heavily, that thousands of tickets had been sold, that her cooperation was no longer optional. Lauren felt the heat of dozens of eyes on her, the weight of expectation pressing down like chains, but she did not flinch. Instead, she reached into the folder she carried and drew out the certified documents from the county office, holding them high so the crowd could see the embossed seals that shimmered in the sun. She declared that the signatures were forged, that the boundary adjustments had been falsified, that the board had no authority over her land, and that she had evidence to prove it. Her voice rose above the murmurs, firm and unwavering, and for the first time she saw uncertainty flicker across the faces of the contractors. The neat fiction Ellington had spun was fraying in their hands. Marcus's smile collapsed into something colder, a hard line etched with fury. He stepped closer to the gate, his voice dropping low so only she could hear. He warned her that she was making a mistake, that the law was on his side, that once the courts became involved she would lose everything anyway, and better to yield now than to drown later. Lauren looked him directly in the eye and told him that the law was exactly where this was headed, that the sheriff was already on his way with copies of her complaint, and that every word he spoke today would be remembered when he stood in front of a judge. The muscles in his jaw twitched, and for the first time his mask of control slipped. The standoff broke not with violence but with hesitation. Vendors, sensing the weight of liability, began climbing back into their vans. Drivers muttered about wasted fuel and wasted time. The buses turned slowly, their passengers peering out the windows at the woman who had barred the gates of her land with nothing but chains and conviction. Ellington tried to rally them, raising his voice, but the certainty was gone, replaced by the stammering fury of a man who realized he could not bend reality with confidence alone. The caravan dispersed in fragments, dust rising behind the retreating vehicles, leaving only the black SUV idling like a vulture by the roadside. Ellington lingered a moment longer, his eyes fixed on her through the bars of the gate. And in that silence Lauren understood that though the day was hers, the war was not finished. Yet, when he finally turned and climbed back into his vehicle, the relief that washed through her was fierce and unyielding. She had stopped them at the threshold. She had preserved the sanctity of her land. And though battles remained ahead in courtrooms and records offices, the festival that had threatened to trample her home had been driven away. For the first time in weeks, as she leaned against the cool iron and felt the breeze sweep across her fields, she allowed herself to believe that she could win. In the days after the confrontation, Lauren felt the weight of silence return to the ranch, yet it was no longer the silence of isolation or grief, but a silence filled with the strange echo of victory. The fields lay untouched, the gates stood locked, and the only tracks in the dirt were those of her own boots and the hooves of her horses. But she could still see the image of the caravan dispersing in clouds of dust, the look on Ellington's face. When his certainty finally fractured, she knew the battle had not ended there at the gate, that papers would still arrive in her mailbox and hearings would be scheduled in distant courtrooms. Yet she also knew that something fundamental had shifted. The ranch was not a rumor or an asset on a spreadsheet. It was her home, her memory, her inheritance, and she had proven to herself and to anyone watching that no glossy brochure or fabricated signature could turn it into something else without her consent. Word spread quickly through the community, not by headlines or cameras, but by the slower, quieter current of neighbors who had watched from a distance and whispered to one another. Some who had believed the HOA's narrative began to doubt. Others who had remained silent out of fear approached her fence to offer awkward words of respect, and though she accepted their gestures cautiously, she felt a small spark of vindication that the truth had begun to take root beyond her own voice. Aidan remained for a while longer, helping her reinforce the boundaries, installing heavier locks and placing posts where the wire had been cut, and in the evenings they sat on the porch not speaking much, but the comfort of his presence reminded her that she was not entirely alone. When he finally left, promising to return if needed, Lauren stood by the gate and watched his truck vanish down the road, and she realized that what mattered most was not whether Ellington would return with more documents or whether the HOA would try, again under another name. What mattered was that she had drawn her line in the dirt and refused to let it be crossed. The land remained hers, untamed and unbroken, and the memory of Daniel lived on in every fence post and every stretch of pasture. For the first time since his death, she felt not just the burden of keeping his legacy, but the strength of defending it. And as the sun set behind the hills, casting the ranch in gold, Lauren knew that whatever battles still waited, she had already claimed the most important victory: the right to say no and to be heard.